The autumn fog rolled thick through the Blue Ridge Mountains like a living thing, swallowing the pine trees and rocky outcrops in its ghostly embrace. Down in the valley, the small town of Millbrook, North Carolina stirred to life on what would prove to be one of the most significant mornings in its history. It was October 12, 1934, and the Great Depression had settled over these mountain communities like a second winter that never seemed to end. The old courthouse bell tolled 7 times, its bronze voice echoing off the weathered storefronts and modest homes that lined Main Street, calling the townspeople to gather for an event that everyone dreaded but circumstances had made necessary. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel Hayes stood at the edge of the growing crowd, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long since cooled in the mountain air. At 38, Sam carried himself with the solid presence of a man who had spent his life working with his hands, first in the logging camps that dotted these ancient mountains, then on the small farm he had carved from the rocky soil high above the valley. His brown hair was streaked with premature silver, and deep lines framed eyes that had seen too much hardship for someone not yet 40. The scar that ran along his left forearm told the story of a logging accident that had ended his career in the timber industry, while the calluses on his palms spoke of the years since spent trying to make a living from land that seemed determined to resist every effort at cultivation. Sam's presence at the courthouse gathering was unusual enough to draw curious glances from his neighbors. For the past 2 years, since Martha's death from tuberculosis, he had become something of a hermit, venturing down from his mountain property only when absolutely necessary to purchase supplies or conduct business. The grief that had settled over him after losing his wife had been compounded by a deeper, more private pain that he shared with no one. 8 years of marriage had produced no children, and the mountain community's unspoken assumption that the fault lay with Martha had been proven cruelly wrong when her dying breath had whispered the truth that would haunt him forever. The problem had been his all along, a failing that in these traditional mountain communities felt like a fundamental betrayal of manhood itself. The Hayes family had owned their mountain property for 3 generations, ever since Sam's grandfather had claimed a homestead in the years following the Civil War. What had once been a thriving family farm supporting parents, children, and extended relatives had dwindled over the decades to just Sam and Martha, and now to Sam alone. The 150 acres of steep, rocky terrain included some of the most beautiful and challenging land in western North Carolina, with a clear mountain stream that never ran dry, stands of oak and pine that could provide timber for building, and an old apple orchard that still produced fruit when the weather cooperated. But beauty didn't pay bills, and the isolation that had once seemed like a blessing now felt like a prison sentence. The reason for this morning's gathering was the kind of community obligation that nobody wanted to acknowledge, but everyone understood was necessary. Judge Theodore Whitman had called a special session to address the placement of 4 children, whose circumstances had overwhelmed the informal support systems that mountain communities typically relied upon to care for their own. The Collins children had been living with various neighbors and church families since the mine collapse 3 months earlier that had claimed their parents along with 7 other men. But the economic pressures facing every household in the county had made long-term care arrangements impossible to sustain. Thomas and Sarah Collins had been well-regarded members of the community, the kind of people who contributed more than they took and raised their children to do the same. Tom had worked a copper mine that provided one of the few sources of steady employment in the region, while Sarah had taken in sewing and helped other women with difficult births when the doctor couldn't make the long journey up the mountain roads. Their 4 children had been regular fixtures at church services and community gatherings, polite and well-behaved in the way that spoke of parents who took their responsibilities seriously and understood that their children's behavior reflected on the entire family's reputation. The mine accident that claimed Tom Collins and 7 other fathers had been the kind of industrial disaster that small communities never fully recover from. A combination of unsafe conditions, aging equipment, and cost-cutting measures by the mining company had created a situation where a routine blasting operation had triggered a massive cave-in that trapped 9 men beneath tons of rock and earth. The rescue efforts had continued for nearly a week, with every able-bodied man in the county taking shifts digging through the debris. But by the time they reached the trapped miners, it was far too late. The funerals had been held on a gray September morning that seemed to reflect the mood of an entire community grappling with losses that extended far beyond the individual families directly affected. Sarah Collins had survived her husband by less than a month, succumbing to what the doctor diplomatically termed a failure of the heart. But what everyone understood was the kind of grief that simply couldn't be borne. She had spent those final weeks making arrangements for her children's care, writing letters to distant relatives who might be willing to take them in, and preparing them as best she could for a future that would be very different from the secure, loving home they had always known. Her death had left 4 children between the ages of 6 and 12 without parents, without resources, and without any clear path forward in a community where every family was already struggling to survive. Emma Collins, at 12, had taken on the role of surrogate mother to her 3 younger siblings with the kind of determined responsibility that tragic circumstances sometimes force on children before they're ready for adult burdens. She was tall for her age, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's steady gray eyes, and she approached the challenge of keeping her family together with a maturity that impressed and heartbroken the adults who had been trying to help them. Emma could cook simple meals, mend clothes, and manage household tasks with competence that would have been remarkable in someone twice her age. But she was still a child who needed guidance and support, even as she tried to provide those same things for her siblings. Tommy Collins, 10 years old and already showing signs of inheriting his father's broad shoulders and strong back, had responded to his family's tragedy by trying to become the man of the family overnight. He spoke little but worked hard at whatever tasks the adults gave him, whether it was splitting wood, caring for livestock, or helping with harvest activities. His quiet determination masked a deep worry about what would happen to his sisters and little brother, and a desperate desire to prove that he could take care of them if someone would just give him the chance. Tommy had his father's practical intelligence and his mother's gentle nature, but at 10 years old, he lacked the resources and legal standing to keep his family together, no matter how willing he was to try. Lucy Collins, 8 years old, possessed an artistic temperament that set her apart from her more practically minded siblings. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had inherited her mother's talent for drawing and her father's eye for beauty in the natural world, spending hours creating pictures with whatever materials she could find and seeing wonder in things that others might overlook. Lucy had been her father's special companion on walks through the mountains, learning to identify birds and plants and listening to his stories about the history of their region. The trauma of losing both parents had made her quieter and more withdrawn than she had been before, but her fundamental sweetness and creativity remained intact beneath the grief that she was still too young to fully understand. Ben Collins, the youngest at 6 years old, brought an irrepressible optimism to his family's dire circumstances that both comforted and worried the adults responsible for his care. He had his mother's bright smile and his father's curiosity about how things worked, and he seemed to view their current situation as a temporary adventure rather than a permanent catastrophe. Ben's resilience was remarkable, but it was also the resilience of a child who didn't fully grasp the permanence of death or the complexity of the challenges facing his older siblings. His ability to find joy in small things and his confidence that everything would work out somehow provided emotional support for Emma, Tommy, and Lucy even as it highlighted how much protection he still needed from the harsh realities of their situation. The informal care arrangements that had sustained the Collins children through the first months after their parents' deaths were beginning to break down under the economic pressures that were affecting every family in the county. The Parkers, who ran the general store, had kept Emma and Lucy for several weeks, but found that feeding 2 additional children was straining their already tight budget beyond the breaking point. Tommy had been staying with the Morrison family, whose own 3 boys welcomed his help with farm chores, but Sheriff Morrison's salary was barely adequate to support his own family, let alone take on permanent responsibility for another child. Ben had been passed between several church families, each household keeping him for a week or 2 before the burden of additional expenses and the demands of caring for a grieving 6-year-old became too much to manage alongside their own responsibilities. The decision to hold a formal placement auction had been made reluctantly by Judge Whitman and the other community leaders after it became clear that voluntary arrangements were not going to provide stable, long-term homes for the 4 children. Nobody liked the idea of treating children like property to be sold to the highest bidder, but the alternative was sending them to the state orphanage in Asheville, where they would disappear into an institutional system that rarely produced successful outcomes and would guarantee their permanent separation from each other and from the mountain community that had shaped their early years. Judge Whitman had tried to make the process as dignified as possible by emphasizing that families taking in the children would be providing homes rather than acquiring workers, and by setting minimum requirements for education and proper care. That went beyond simple food and shelter. But everyone present understood the economic realities underlying the formal language. These were children who needed homes, and the families willing to take them in expected that the children would contribute meaningfully to household operations through work appropriate to their ages and abilities. In a community where every family was struggling financially, charity that didn't include some element of practical benefit was simply not sustainable. The morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and the last of the season's apple harvest, familiar smells that usually brought Sam comfort, but today seemed to emphasize the loneliness that had become his constant companion. He had come to the courthouse not because he was interested in taking in children, but because staying away would have marked him as completely separate from his community in a way that even his grief-induced isolation hadn't accomplished. Mountain communities valued self-reliance, but they also expected their members to participate in collective responsibilities, and the placement of orphan children was exactly the kind of community obligation that required everyone's presence, even if not everyone's active participation. Sam's financial situation was precarious enough that taking on additional responsibilities would have seemed like madness to anyone who knew the details of his circumstances. The mountain farm that had supported his family for 3 generations was barely generating enough income to meet his own basic needs, and the isolation that made the property beautiful also made it impractical for the kind of diversified agriculture that might have provided financial stability. His apple orchard produced well in good years, but getting the fruit to market required a full day's journey down treacherous mountain roads that were frequently impassable in bad weather. The timber on his land had value, but harvesting it required equipment and labor that he couldn't afford, and selling the standing trees would provide only short-term relief, while permanently reducing the property's long-term value. The small amount of money in Sam's pocket represented the last of his emergency reserves, carefully hoarded against the kind of crisis that could mean the difference between survival and losing everything his family had built over 3 generations. $4.23 was not a fortune by any measure, but in 1934 it represented several days' wages for those fortunate enough to have steady employment. Sam had earned this money by helping with the harvest at neighboring farms, trading his labor for cash payments rather than the more common arrangements involving shared crops or bartered goods. He had planned to use this money to purchase winter supplies that would help him get through the lean months ahead, but something about the morning's proceedings was making him reconsider his careful financial planning. As Judge Whitman called the gathering to order and began explaining the procedures that would govern the placement process, Sam found himself studying the 4 Collins children who stood quietly beside the courthouse steps. Emma held herself with the kind of dignified composure that reminded him painfully of Martha during her final illness, when she had faced the inevitability of death with courage that had both inspired and devastated him. Tommy's protective stance near his sisters echoed Sam's own instincts about family responsibility, while Lucy's artistic eyes seemed to be taking in details that others might miss, finding beauty even in circumstances that were fundamentally tragic. Ben's obvious trust in his older siblings and his confidence that the adults around him would make decisions in his best interests touched something deep in Sam's chest that he had thought was permanently numbed by loss and disappointment. The bidding process began with household goods and farm equipment that other families were selling to raise money or reduce their possessions to what they could reasonably manage. Sam watched his neighbors evaluate items that represented other people's attempts to build comfortable lives, seeing furniture that had been crafted with hope and tools that had been purchased with dreams of prosperity. The economic desperation underlying these transactions was evident in the low prices and the reluctant participation of both buyers and sellers, but the community's commitment to helping each other survive difficult times was equally apparent in the respectful way that personal possessions were handled and the fair prices that were paid even when people could barely afford them. When Judge Whitman announced that the placement portion of the morning's business would begin, the mood of the gathering shifted noticeably. Conversations that had been continuing in low voices died away entirely, and people who had been moving around to examine goods for sale found places to stand and focused their attention on the 4 children, who would soon learn what their futures held. The judge consulted his notes with the careful precision of someone who understood that the decisions made in the next hour would shape these children's entire lives, and his voice carried unusual weight when he began describing their circumstances and their needs. Emma Collins was presented first, with Judge Whitman emphasizing her domestic skills and her remarkable maturity in caring for her younger siblings since their parents' deaths. The bidding was hesitant and uncomfortable, with families clearly struggling between their desire to help and their realistic assessment of what they could afford to take on. Emma was finally placed with the Wells family, where Mrs. Dorothy Wells believed that her teaching experience would help the girl continue her education while contributing to household management for elderly relatives who were no longer able to manage entirely on their own. Tommy Collins generated more interest because his age and size made him valuable for farm work, and because boys were generally considered less expensive to maintain than girls, who required more attention to clothing and social development. The Morrison family ultimately committed to taking him permanently, recognizing that their own boys would benefit from Tommy's steady work ethic, and that the additional labor would help their farming operation become more productive. Tommy accepted this placement with quiet dignity, but Sam could see the pain in the boy's eyes as he realized he was being separated from the siblings who had been his primary responsibility since becoming an orphan. Lucy Collins presented a more complex challenge because her artistic temperament and small size meant that she couldn't contribute significant physical labor, while her emotional needs following her parents' deaths required the kind of patient attention that many families simply couldn't provide alongside their existing responsibilities. The bidding for Lucy was slower and more reluctant, with families clearly calculating whether their budgets could absorb the cost of caring for a child who wouldn't be able to contribute meaningfully to household productivity for several more years. Eventually, the Parker family agreed to take her, partly because Mrs. Parker had always wanted a daughter, and partly because Lucy's artistic abilities might eventually contribute to the store's business through sign-making and decorative work. That left Ben Collins, 6 years old and small even for his age, standing alone beside the courthouse steps with his wooden toy horse clutched in his small hands. Ben represented the most challenging placement scenario because he was too young. To contribute any significant work would require years of food, clothing, and care before becoming productive, and needed the kind of patient nurturing that was difficult to provide when every adult was already overwhelmed by economic pressures and existing family obligations. Judge Whitman's voice grew less confident as he described Ben's good nature and his adaptability, but everyone present understood the mathematics of the situation. The bidding for Ben was painfully slow, with long silences punctuated by reluctant offers that reflected families' genuine desire to help balanced against their realistic assessment of what they could manage. As the offers grew smaller and less frequent, Sam felt something shifting inside his chest, a familiar sensation that he recognized from his logging days when he had seen accidents about to happen and had moved to prevent them without consciously deciding to act. Ben Collins reminded him of himself at that age, full of curiosity and trust, confident that the adults around him would take care of him no matter what challenges they were facing. When Judge Whitman's voice dropped to ask for any final bids for Ben's placement, and the silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long, Sam found himself stepping forward before he had made any conscious decision to do so. His voice, when it came, sounded strange to his own ears, rougher than he had intended and carrying emotions that he hadn't realized were so close to the surface. $4, he said, and the simplicity of the offer seemed to hang in the mountain air like a challenge to everything that had come before. $4 for the boy. The crowd turned to stare at Sam Hayes with expressions ranging from surprise to outright confusion. $4 was more money than most families in Millbrook had seen in a single transaction for months, and the idea that the reclusive mountain farmer would spend his last reserves on a 6-year-old boy who couldn't contribute meaningful work for years seemed like the kind of decision that desperation or grief might drive a man to make. Judge Whitman blinked several times, consulting his papers as if checking to make sure he had heard correctly, while murmurs rippled through the gathered townspeople as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. Sam Hayes had lived on Hayes Mountain for all of his 38 years, born in the same log cabin where his grandfather had first settled after returning from the war, between the states with nothing but a land grant and the determination to build something lasting. In these ancient hills, the property encompassed some of the most beautiful and challenging terrain in western North Carolina, with steep slopes covered in oak and pine, rocky outcroppings that provided spectacular views of the surrounding valleys, and a clear mountain stream that had never been known to run dry, even during the worst droughts. The Hayes family had scratched out a living from this land for 3 generations, supplementing farming with logging, hunting, and whatever other work the mountains could provide. Sam's father, Robert Hayes, had been a man of few words but deep convictions, who had taught his son that the measure of a man was not in what he accumulated, but in how he treated those who couldn't protect themselves. Robert had died when Sam was 25, passing away quietly in his sleep after a day spent mending fences and checking on the apple trees that provided their primary cash crop. Sam's mother, Grace, had followed her husband 2 years later, succumbing to pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter that had isolated the mountain property for weeks at a time. Their deaths had left Sam alone on the mountain with Martha, his wife of 3 years, and dreams of filling the old homestead with children who would carry on the family legacy. Martha Caldwell Hayes had been the daughter of the Methodist minister in Millbrook, a woman of deep faith and practical intelligence who had fallen in love with Sam's quiet strength and his vision of what their life together could become. She had adapted to the isolation and physical demands of mountain living with remarkable grace, learning to preserve food, tend livestock, and manage the countless tasks that kept a remote homestead functioning. Martha had possessed the kind of natural wisdom about healing and midwifery that made her invaluable to other mountain families, and she had delivered more than a dozen babies in the cabins scattered throughout the region during their 8 years of marriage. The inability to have children of their own had been a source of private anguish that neither Sam nor Martha had discussed openly, even with each other. In the mountain communities of the 1930s, childlessness was typically assumed to be the woman's failing, and Martha had endured years of well-meaning advice about herbs and prayers and medical treatments that might solve their problem. It wasn't until her final illness, when the tuberculosis had weakened her enough that painful truths seemed easier to share, that she had whispered the confession that had shattered Sam's understanding of their marriage and himself. The problem had never been hers. A childhood fever had left Sam sterile, a fact that Martha had somehow discovered through conversations with the doctor in Asheville, but had never revealed because she knew how deeply it would wound his pride and his sense of masculine identity. Martha's death 2 years earlier had left Sam not only grieving the loss of his beloved wife, but also grappling with the knowledge that his body's inability to create life had robbed them both of the family they had dreamed of building together. The shame he felt was complicated by the realization that Martha had carried this secret for years, protecting his feelings at the cost of allowing their community to judge her as somehow deficient. The guilt that accompanied this understanding had driven him deeper into isolation, avoiding the social gatherings where other men talked about their children and their hopes for future generations. The Hayes Mountain property had been designed and built with large families in mind. The original cabin had been expanded over the decades to include 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and common areas that could accommodate multiple generations living together. The barn was large enough to house livestock and equipment for a substantial farming operation, while the various outbuildings provided space for workshops, food storage, and the countless activities that supported self-sufficient mountain living. Every aspect of the homestead reflected the assumption that it would be filled with children, grandchildren, and the extended family networks that had traditionally sustained mountain communities. Living alone in spaces designed for a large family had become a daily reminder of Sam's perceived failures, and the echo of his footsteps in empty rooms had grown increasingly difficult to bear. The practical challenges of maintaining the property single-handedly were compounded by the emotional weight of unused bedrooms and silent meals eaten at a table built to seat 8 people. Sam had considered selling the property and moving to town, but the land represented 3 generations of Hayes family history, and abandoning it would have felt like a final acknowledgement that his family line would end with him. The economic pressures of the Great Depression had made Sam's situation even more precarious. The apple orchard that provided his primary income was productive only in alternate years, and even good harvests were difficult to monetize because of the challenges involved in getting fruit to market over mountain roads that became impassable during bad weather. The timber on his property had significant value, but harvesting it required equipment and labor that he couldn't afford, while selling the standing trees would provide only temporary financial relief at the cost of permanently reducing the land's productivity. Sam supplemented his farming income by working for neighbors during planting and harvest seasons, trading his labor for cash payments that helped him purchase the supplies he couldn't produce himself. His skills as a former logger made him valuable for construction projects and land clearing, but such work was sporadic and depended on other families having money to pay for improvements they could postpone if necessary. The $4.23 in his pocket represented weeks of careful saving, earned by helping the Morrison family bring in their corn crop and assisting the Parkers with repairs to their store's roof. The decision to bid on Ben Collins had emerged from some deep place in Sam's psyche that operated independently of rational financial planning. Watching the small boy stand alone beside the courthouse steps, clutching his wooden horse while adults calculated his value in terms of work potential and maintenance costs, had triggered memories of Sam's own childhood fears about being abandoned or unwanted. More than that, something about Ben's trusting expression and his obvious affection for his siblings had awakened paternal instincts that Sam had thought were permanently buried along with his dreams of fatherhood. Judge Whitman cleared his throat and addressed Sam directly, his voice carrying the careful formality that legal proceedings required even in informal mountain communities. "Mr. Hayes, you've bid $4 for the placement of Benjamin Collins. Are you prepared to provide appropriate care, education, and moral guidance for this child, understanding that this placement is intended to be permanent rather than temporary?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words, because everyone present understood that taking responsibility for an orphan child was a commitment that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Sam nodded slowly, his eyes moving from Judge Whitman to Ben Collins, who was watching the proceedings with the kind of intense attention that children bring to adult conversations they don't fully understand, but sense are important to their futures. "I am," Sam replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was committing to. "The boy will have a home, and he'll be raised right." The simplicity of his statement masked the complexity of what he was promising, but the conviction in his voice convinced Judge Whitman that this wasn't an impulsive decision made without consideration of its implications. The paperwork required for Ben's placement was completed with the efficient dispatch that characterized most legal proceedings in small mountain communities. Sam signed documents that made him legally responsible for Ben's welfare, education, and development, promising to provide not just food and shelter, but the kind of guidance that would help the boy grow into a productive and moral adult. The financial transaction was handled with equal simplicity, with Sam counting out $4 bills that represented a significant portion of his total resources, but felt like the best investment he had ever made. As the official business concluded, and the crowd began to disperse, Sam approached Ben Collins with the kind of careful attention he might have used when approaching a wild animal that could be frightened by sudden movements. The boy looked up at him with eyes that held curiosity mixed with uncertainty, clearly trying to process the fact that his life had just changed in ways that he couldn't fully comprehend. Ben was small for his age, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had been mended multiple times, but were still clean and respectable, thanks to the care he had received from various church families. "Hello, Ben," Sam said quietly, crouching down to bring himself to the boy's eye level in the same way he had seen Martha interact with the children she had helped deliver and care for over the years. "I'm Sam Hayes, and I live up on the mountain above town. You're going to come live with me now, and we'll figure out how to take care of each other." The words felt strange in his mouth because he had so little experience talking to children, but something about Ben's attentive expression encouraged him to continue. Ben studied Sam's face with the kind of direct gaze that children use when they're trying to determine whether an adult can be trusted. After a moment that seemed to stretch much longer than it actually lasted, Ben smiled with the resilience that had helped him survive the trauma of losing both parents and being passed between temporary caregivers for months. "Are you going to be my new papa?" he asked, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone that children use for questions that would tie adults in emotional knots. The question hit Sam with unexpected force, touching on dreams and losses that he had thought were safely buried beneath layers of practical concern and emotional numbness. The idea of being called Papa by anyone had seemed impossible since Martha's deathbed revelation about his sterility, but looking at Ben's trusting face, Sam felt something shift inside his chest that he hadn't experienced since his wife's death. "I don't know what you should call me," he admitted honestly, "but I promise you'll have a home where you're wanted, and we'll figure out the rest as we go along." The walk from town to the Hayes Mountain property was a journey of nearly 3 miles along roads that grew progressively steeper and more challenging as they climbed away from the valley floor. Sam had brought his old mule, Jasper, pulling a wooden cart that served for transportation when walking wasn't practical, and Ben rode beside him with the wide-eyed attention of a child seeing new territory for the first time. The autumn colors were at their peak, with maples and oaks displaying brilliant reds and golds against the darker green of pine and fir trees, and the mountain views opened up dramatically as they gained elevation. Ben proved to be a natural conversationalist, asking questions about everything he saw and sharing observations that revealed both intelligence and the kind of wonder that adults often lose as they become focused on practical concerns. He wanted to know about the different types of trees, the birds that called from the forest, and the history of the various homesteads they passed along the way. Sam found himself enjoying the boy's curiosity and realizing how much he had missed having someone to share the beauty and complexity of mountain life with during the 2 years since Martha's death. As they approached the Hayes homestead, Sam began seeing his property through Ben's eyes and feeling embarrassed by what the boy would find. The log cabin that had seemed adequate for a grieving widower suddenly appeared shabby and neglected, with obvious signs of deferred maintenance and the kind of bachelor housekeeping that prioritized function over comfort. The barn and outbuildings were structurally sound but showed their age, while the apple orchard looked sparse compared to the full productivity it had achieved during the years when Martha's care had supplemented Sam's agricultural efforts. Ben's reaction to his new home surprised Sam with its enthusiasm rather than disappointment. The boy climbed down from the cart and immediately began exploring, exclaiming over the mountain stream that ran behind the house, the chickens that pecked around the barnyard, and the spectacular view of distant ridges that stretched to the horizon. "This is like living in the clouds," Ben said with genuine delight, and Sam realized that what he had been seeing as isolation and challenge, the boy was experiencing as adventure and possibility. The practical challenges of their new living arrangement became apparent as soon as they entered the cabin. Sam had been existing in essentially one room, using the kitchen for cooking and eating while sleeping in the bedroom he had shared with Martha. The other bedrooms had been closed off to save on heating costs, and the common area showed the neglect of someone who had stopped caring about domestic comfort. Ben would need not just a place to sleep, but a sense that the house was a home, rather than simply a shelter. Sam spent the rest of that first day attempting to prepare appropriate accommodations for his new house guest, opening shuttered windows to air out unused rooms, and trying to remember where Martha had stored the household items that would be necessary for caring for a child. Ben helped with these preparations with the eager enthusiasm of someone who was genuinely excited about his new circumstances, asking constant questions about the house's history and the various objects they discovered in closets and storage areas. The evening routine revealed just how unprepared Sam was for the practical aspects of child care. Cooking for 2 people instead of 1 required different planning and proportions, while ensuring that Ben had appropriate clothing and washing facilities highlighted how much Martha had contributed to the domestic organization that Sam had taken for granted. More challenging was the emotional work of helping a grieving 6-year-old process his feelings about losing his parents while adapting to life with a virtual stranger in an unfamiliar environment. Ben's bedtime brought the first real test of Sam's commitment to this new responsibility. The boy had been remarkably resilient throughout the day, but as darkness fell and the reality of sleeping in a strange place without his siblings nearby began to sink in, he became quiet and withdrawn in a way that reminded Sam painfully of his own response to loss and uncertainty. Sam found himself sitting beside Ben's bed, trying to provide the kind of comfort and reassurance that Martha would have offered naturally, but that felt awkward and uncertain coming from someone with no experience in such matters. "Mr. Sam," Ben said quietly as they sat together in the lamplight, "do you think Emma and Tommy and Lucy are scared tonight too?" The question revealed the depth of the boy's concern for his siblings and his understanding that their family had been scattered in ways that might be permanent. Sam realized that Ben's resilience during the day had masked deeper worries about whether he would ever see his brothers and sisters again, and whether the adults who had taken responsibility for them could be trusted to keep their promises about care and protection. Sam considered his response carefully, understanding that what he said now would establish patterns of honesty and trust that would shape their relationship going forward. "I think they probably are scared," he admitted. "It's natural to be frightened when everything changes at once. But I also think they're probably glad you're somewhere safe, just like you want them to be safe. And maybe we can find ways to see them sometimes, so you don't lose touch with each other." The promise of maintaining contact with his siblings seemed to provide Ben with the reassurance he needed to settle into sleep, though Sam could hear him talking quietly to himself and occasionally sniffling as he processed the day's events. Sam remained in the room until he was certain the boy was truly asleep, then retreated to his own bedroom to contemplate the magnitude of what he had committed to and to begin planning how he would manage the practical and emotional challenges that lay ahead. The first weeks of their life together established routines and revealed both the challenges and the unexpected rewards of their unusual family arrangement. Ben proved to be remarkably adaptable, approaching each day with curiosity and energy that gradually began to penetrate the isolation and depression that had characterized Sam's existence since Martha's death. The boy's constant questions and observations forced Sam to see his familiar surroundings from new perspectives, while his obvious delight in mountain life validated choices that Sam had been questioning during his darkest periods of grief and self-doubt. The practical aspects of caring for a 6-year-old required Sam to develop skills and systems that he had never needed as a bachelor. Cooking became more complex as he tried to provide nutritious meals that would appeal to a child's tastes while working with the limited ingredients available in their remote location. Clothing required constant attention as Ben grew, and his garments suffered the inevitable damage that active children inflict on fabric. Most challenging was the educational component of his responsibilities, since Ben needed instruction that would prepare him for eventual integration into the broader community and economy. Sam's lack of formal education beyond basic reading and arithmetic became a source of anxiety as he recognized that Ben deserved opportunities that extended beyond what mountain farming could provide. He began making trips to town specifically to borrow books from families whose children had outgrown them, and he spent evenings working through mathematical problems and reading exercises with the kind of dedicated attention he had previously reserved for agricultural planning. The intellectual stimulation of helping Ben learn proved to be one of the unexpected benefits of their arrangement, forcing Sam to engage with ideas and concepts that had been absent from his solitary existence. The seasonal rhythms of mountain life provided natural structure for Ben's education and development. Autumn brought lessons in food preservation and preparation for winter, as Sam taught the boy how to can apples, cure meat, and store root vegetables in ways that would sustain them through the lean months ahead. Winter offered opportunities for indoor projects like woodworking and leather craft, while spring brought intensive instruction in planting, animal care, and the countless skills required for successful farming in challenging terrain. Ben's natural intelligence and eagerness to learn made him an ideal student for this kind of practical education, but Sam recognized that academic instruction was equally important for the boy's future success. He established evening routines that included reading, writing practice, and mathematical exercises that went beyond the basic arithmetic required for farming operations. More importantly, he began to understand that Ben's quick mind and verbal abilities suggested potential that extended far beyond what their isolated mountain existence could fully develop. The financial challenges of supporting 2 people instead of 1 required Sam to become more creative and aggressive in generating income from his property. He began making regular trips to town to sell eggs, produce, and crafted items that could supplement the seasonal income from apple sales. More significantly, he started taking on construction projects that utilized his logging experience and Martha's teaching about managing complex tasks efficiently. The additional income was essential, but the work also provided opportunities for Ben to accompany him and learn skills that would be valuable regardless of what path his life ultimately took. The social aspects of their arrangement proved more complex than Sam had anticipated. Mountain communities valued self-reliance and respected privacy, but they also expected families to participate in collective activities that maintained social cohesion and mutual support networks. Ben's presence in Sam's life meant renewed involvement. In church services, community gatherings, and the informal networks of assistance that helped mountain families survive difficult times. This forced reintegration into social life was painful for Sam, who had grown comfortable with isolation. But it was essential for Ben's healthy development and future success. The boy's natural sociability and resilience made him popular with other families, who welcomed his energy and curiosity while offering assistance and guidance that supplemented Sam's efforts. Mrs. Dorothy Wells, the elderly schoolteacher, took particular interest in Ben's education, providing books and exercises that challenged his developing abilities. Dr. Henry Coleman monitored his health and development with the kind of attention that ensured any problems would be addressed quickly and effectively. Pastor William Grant included Ben in church activities and youth programs that provided social interaction with other children and exposure to moral and ethical instruction. Most importantly, the community's acceptance of their family arrangement provided validation that Sam's decision to take responsibility for Ben had been wise and beneficial for both of them. The boy's obvious happiness and healthy development served as evidence that unusual family structures could be successful when they were based on genuine care and commitment rather than mere convenience or economic calculation. This community support would prove essential as they faced the challenges and crises that would test their relationship in the months and years ahead. The transformation in Sam's own outlook and behavior became apparent to everyone who knew him as the weeks passed and his adjustment to fatherhood progressed. The depression and isolation that had characterized his life since Martha's death began to lift as he found purpose and meaning in caring for Ben and planning for their shared future. The practical demands of raising a child forced him to think beyond mere survival to consider questions of growth, opportunity, and legacy that had seemed irrelevant during his period of solitary grief. Ben's presence also reawakened Sam's interest in improving and expanding their mountain homestead. Projects that had seemed pointless when he was living alone took on new significance as investments in creating a home that could support a child's development and provide opportunities for learning and growth. The unused bedrooms were opened and furnished, the common areas were reorganized to accommodate shared activities, and the various outbuildings were repaired and upgraded to support expanded agricultural and educational operations. The emotional bond that developed between Sam and Ben surprised both of them with its strength and naturalness. Despite the unusual circumstances of their relationship's beginning, they discovered genuine affection and compatibility that made their daily interactions enjoyable rather than merely dutiful. Sam's patient teaching style complemented Ben's eager learning, while the boy's optimism and energy provided balance for Sam's more serious and cautious temperament. Most remarkably, Ben's unconscious assumption that Sam was his father in every meaningful sense helped Sam accept a parental identity that his biological limitations had made him believe was impossible. The approaching winter of 1934 would test their new family arrangement in ways that neither Sam nor Ben could fully anticipate. The mountains of North Carolina were known for harsh weather that could isolate homesteads for weeks at a time, while the economic pressures of the Great Depression continued to strain every family's resources and resilience. More challenging would be the unexpected events that would reveal connections between Sam's past and Ben's family history, leading to moments of recognition and understanding that would transform their relationship from one of convenience and compassion to something deeper and more permanent. But as autumn deepened into the early signs of winter, and as their daily routines became established patterns that felt increasingly natural, both Sam and Ben sensed that they had found in each other exactly what they had been missing. The mountain homestead that had echoed with loneliness and unfulfilled dreams was becoming a home where a man who thought he could never be a father was learning to raise a boy who needed someone to believe in his potential and fight for his future. The $4 that had seemed like Sam's last financial resource had purchased something far more valuable than either of them had imagined possible when that transaction began their unlikely partnership. Winter descended on the Blue Ridge Mountains with the kind of sudden ferocity that reminded even longtime residents why these ancient peaks commanded respect and careful preparation. The first major snowfall arrived 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, dumping 18 inches of heavy, wet snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something both beautiful and treacherous. Sam Hayes stood at his kitchen window, watching the white accumulation bend pine boughs nearly to the breaking point while calculating how long their carefully hoarded supplies would need to last if the mountain roads became impassable for extended periods. Ben Collins pressed his face against the glass beside Sam, his breath fogging the window as he watched snowflakes swirl past in patterns that seemed almost alive in their complexity. For a 6-year-old who had spent his entire life in the valley town where snow was an occasional novelty rather than a seasonal siege, the mountain winter was a source of wonder rather than worry. He had never seen snow fall with such intensity or accumulate to depths that made even familiar landmarks unrecognizable. The world beyond their cabin had become a magical landscape, where ordinary objects transformed into mysterious shapes and distances became impossible to judge accurately. The contrast between Ben's excitement and Sam's concern highlighted one of the fundamental challenges of their new family arrangement. Sam's experience with mountain winters had taught him to approach each snowfall as a potential crisis that could cut them off from outside assistance and force them to survive on whatever resources they had managed to accumulate during warmer months. Food preservation, fuel conservation, and equipment maintenance took on life or death significance when the nearest neighbors were miles away and professional help was completely inaccessible. Ben's innocent enthusiasm for the beauty of the snow reminded Sam of how different childhood perspectives could be from adult anxieties, but it also emphasized his responsibility to keep them both safe during conditions that had claimed lives even among experienced mountain families. The practical preparations for surviving an isolated mountain winter had occupied much of their time during the autumn months, as Sam taught Ben the essential skills of food preservation, fuel management, and emergency planning that represented generations of accumulated wisdom about staying alive in harsh conditions. Their root cellar now contained carefully arranged stores of potatoes, turnips, carrots, and apples that would provide essential nutrition when fresh vegetables became impossible to obtain. Mason jars filled with preserved fruits, vegetables, and meat-lined wooden shelves that Sam's grandfather had built for exactly this purpose, while barrels of flour, cornmeal, and dried beans provided the staples that would form the foundation of their winter diet. Ben had approached these preparations with the same curiosity and eagerness that characterized his response to most new experiences, asking endless questions about why certain foods needed specific storage conditions and how their ancestors had survived winters before modern conveniences made mountain living somewhat less precarious. His small hands had proven surprisingly capable at tasks like snapping beans for drying, peeling apples for preservation, and organizing supplies according to systems that would make them easily accessible during emergency situations when speed and efficiency could make critical differences. The isolation that winter imposed on their mountain homestead created opportunities for intensive education and skill development that would have been impossible during seasons when outside work demanded most of their attention. Sam established daily routines that combined academic instruction with practical training, using the long evening hours to work on reading, writing, and arithmetic exercises, while afternoon projects focused on woodworking, leathercraft, and the countless manual skills that supported self-sufficient mountain living. Ben's natural intelligence and manual dexterity made him an excellent student for both types of learning, though his 6-year-old attention span required creative approaches to maintaining engagement with challenging material. The academic work proved more demanding than Sam had initially anticipated, partly because Ben's quick mind absorbed information rapidly and constantly demanded more complex challenges, and partly because Sam realized how much his own limited formal education restricted his ability to provide comprehensive instruction. He had learned to read and write adequately for practical purposes, and his mathematical skills extended to the calculations required for farming and construction work. But Ben's potential clearly exceeded what these basic competencies could fully develop. Sam began making dangerous trips to town during brief clear periods, borrowing books from families whose children had advanced beyond elementary instruction, and seeking advice from Mrs. Dorothy was about educational strategies that could maximize Ben's intellectual development. The practical education component of their winter routine focused on skills that would serve Ben, regardless of what direction his adult life ultimately took. Sam taught him to identify different types of wood and understand their various properties for construction and fuel purposes. They worked together on furniture projects that required precise measurement and careful craftsmanship, with Ben learning to use tools safely while developing the hand-eye coordination that would make him capable of complex manual work. Leather working provided lessons in planning and patience, as they prepared boots, gloves, and other essential items that would protect them from weather extremes. The livestock care responsibilities that winter imposed created additional opportunities for Ben to learn about animal husbandry and the biological principles that govern successful farming operations. Their small herd of cattle required daily attention even in harsh weather, teaching Ben about the dedication and consistency that animal care demanded, regardless of personal comfort or convenience. The chickens needed protection from predators and cold while continuing to provide eggs that represented essential protein during months when fresh meat was scarce. Even Jasper the mule required specialized care that helped Ben understand the partnership between humans and animals that made mountain farming possible. Ben's natural affinity for animals became apparent during these winter months as he developed relationships with each creature that went beyond simple caretaking to genuine communication and mutual affection. The cattle learned to respond to his voice and seemed to calm in his presence, while the chickens appeared to lay more consistently under his patient care than they had during Sam's bachelor management. Most remarkably, Jasper the mule, who had always been somewhat temperamental and difficult for Sam to handle, became docile and cooperative when Ben was involved in his care, suggesting an intuitive understanding of animal psychology that couldn't be taught through formal instruction. The social isolation that winter imposed on their mountain homestead was both a challenge and an opportunity for deepening the relationship between Sam and Ben. Without the distractions of outside work and community activities, they were forced to depend entirely on each other for companionship and entertainment. Sam discovered that Ben was naturally inclined toward storytelling and possessed an imagination that could transform ordinary household objects into props for elaborate adventures that filled long winter evenings with laughter and creativity. The boy's ability to find entertainment in simple materials reminded Sam of childhood pleasures he had forgotten during his adult focus on survival and responsibility. Ben's requests for stories about Sam's childhood and family history opened emotional territories that Sam had avoided since Martha's death. The boy was particularly fascinated by tales of Sam's grandfather, who had established their homestead with nothing but determination and basic tools, and by stories of his father's generation, who had expanded the property and created the agricultural systems that still supported their mountain existence. These conversations helped Sam reconnect with positive memories of family legacy while providing Ben with a sense of belonging to something larger than their immediate circumstances. The evenings spent by the fireplace, with Ben practicing his letters while Sam worked on equipment repairs, created a domestic rhythm that both of them found deeply satisfying. The companionship filled emotional needs that neither had fully recognized before their family arrangement began, while the shared activities provided practical benefits that improved their quality of life and their prospects for long-term success. Sam realized that the presence of a child in his life had restored meaning and purpose to daily routines that had become merely mechanical during his period of solitary grief. Ben's questions about his birth family and his parents' death required Sam to navigate sensitive emotional territory with care and honesty. The boy's memories of his mother and father remained vivid and important to his sense of identity, but he also needed to process the trauma of their loss while adapting to his new family situation. Sam found himself serving as both protector and counselor, helping Ben maintain connections to his past while building security in his present circumstances. These conversations deepened their mutual trust while helping Sam understand the complexity of emotions that children experience during major life transitions. The first major crisis of their winter isolation came in January when a series of storms created conditions that tested both their preparation and their relationship under extreme stress. 3 successive blizzards deposited nearly 4 feet of snow around their cabin, while temperatures dropped to levels that made even brief exposure dangerous. The weight of accumulated snow threatened to collapse outbuilding roofs, while wind-driven ice blocked chimneys and created fire hazards that required constant vigilance. Most seriously, their water source began showing signs of freezing, despite previous confidence that their spring would remain accessible throughout even the harshest weather. Ben's response to these emergency conditions revealed character strengths that impressed Sam with their maturity and practical value. The boy remained calm and focused even when circumstances became genuinely frightening, following instructions precisely while contributing useful observations about problems that required immediate attention. His small size proved advantageous for certain emergency tasks, like crawling into confined spaces to clear blocked vents or reaching equipment that had become inaccessible due to snow accumulation. Most importantly, Ben's optimistic temperament provided emotional stability that helped Sam maintain perspective during moments when their situation seemed overwhelming. The physical demands of managing multiple emergencies simultaneously pushed Sam to limits he hadn't experienced since his logging days, when dangerous conditions and equipment failures had required sustained effort under extreme stress. Clearing snow from roofs before structural collapse occurred, maintaining heating systems during equipment failures, and ensuring adequate ventilation while conserving fuel required skills and endurance that had been dormant during his years of routine. Mountain farming. Ben's assistance with these emergency operations proved invaluable, not only for the practical help he provided, but for the motivation his presence gave Sam to persist through exhaustion and discouragement. The resolution of their winter crisis came through a combination of their own resourcefulness and unexpected community assistance that reminded Sam of the mutual support networks that connected mountain families despite geographic isolation. Frank Morrison, the sheriff who lived several miles down the mountain, organized a group of neighbors to check on isolated homesteads after the worst of the storms had passed. The rescue party that arrived at the Hayes property found Sam and Ben in good condition, but clearly in need of supplies and assistance with storm damage that exceeded what one man and a small boy could handle alone. The community response to their situation demonstrated the kind of practical cooperation that enabled mountain families to survive conditions that would overwhelm individual households. Neighbors contributed labor for emergency repairs, shared surplus supplies to replace resources that had been depleted during the crisis, and provided equipment that allowed them to restore normal operations more quickly. than would have been possible through their own efforts alone. Most importantly, the assistance came without judgment or expectation of immediate repayment, reflecting mountain values that prioritize community survival over individual profit. Ben's interaction with the rescue party and the neighbors who came to assist with repairs revealed how much his social skills and confidence had developed during his months with Sam. The boy served as an effective intermediary between Sam's natural reticence and the visitor's curiosity about how their unusual family arrangement was progressing. Ben's obvious health, happiness, and intellectual development provided clear evidence that Sam's care was succeeding by any reasonable measure, while his respectful behavior and practical competence demonstrated that their isolation wasn't preventing proper moral and social development. The conversations that took place during the repair work provided Sam with valuable insights into how their community viewed his decision to take responsibility for Ben and how their family arrangement was perceived by neighbors whose opinions could influence their long-term success. The consensus seemed to be that both Sam and Ben were benefiting from their relationship in ways that justified any unconventional aspects of their situation. Sam's transformation from isolated grief to engaged fatherhood was apparent to everyone who knew him, while Ben's growth and development suggested that he was receiving better care and more comprehensive education than would have been available through most alternative arrangements. Mrs. Dorothy Wells, the elderly schoolteacher who had accompanied the community assistance effort, spent considerable time evaluating Ben's educational progress and providing Sam with guidance about curriculum additions that could further enhance the boy's intellectual development. Her assessment confirmed that Ben was not only keeping pace with children his age, who attended formal schools, but was actually ahead in several areas due to the individualized attention and practical application that characterized his mountain education. Her recommendation that Ben be prepared for eventual advanced education provided Sam with goals and validation that strengthened his commitment to their family arrangement. The winter crisis and its resolution marked a turning point in Sam and Ben's relationship that established patterns of mutual dependence and cooperation that would serve them well during future challenges. Ben's maturity under pressure convinced Sam that the boy possessed character strengths that would enable him to succeed in any environment, while Sam's successful management of emergency conditions demonstrated parental competence that gave Ben confidence in their family stability and future prospects. Most importantly, their shared experience of surviving genuine danger together created emotional bonds that transcended the practical arrangements that had originally brought them together. The remaining winter months passed more peacefully, with established routines and improved preparation helping them manage normal seasonal challenges without the drama of emergency conditions. Ben's education continued to progress at an accelerated pace, with his academic development supplemented by practical skills that would serve him regardless of what career path he ultimately chose. Sam's confidence as a parent grew through daily success in meeting Ben's needs while maintaining the property and planning for future improvements that would benefit both of them. The approach of spring brought anticipation of renewed contact with the broader community and opportunities to evaluate how their family experiment was succeeding, compared to the other orphan placements that had occurred during the same courthouse auction. Sam was particularly interested in learning how Ben's siblings were adapting to their respective situations, and whether the separations that had seemed necessary at the time were proving beneficial for everyone involved. Ben's continuing concern for Emma, Tommy, and Lucy suggested that maintaining some connection between the scattered siblings would be important for everyone's emotional well-being. The educational component of their winter routine had revealed Ben's particular strengths in areas that suggested potential for advanced training that exceeded what their mountain isolation could provide indefinitely. His mathematical abilities were developing rapidly beyond basic arithmetic toward concepts that would require formal instruction for full development. His reading comprehension had progressed to levels that demanded more sophisticated materials than were readily available in their rural community. Most significantly, his natural curiosity about how things worked and his manual dexterity with tools suggested aptitudes that could lead to careers in engineering or other technical fields if properly cultivated. Sam began considering long-term planning questions about Ben's education and future opportunities that would require difficult decisions about balancing family stability against the boy's potential for achievements that might necessitate leaving their mountain community. The tension between providing security through familiar routines and preparing Ben for success in a broader world reflected challenges that many rural families faced during an era when economic and social changes were creating new possibilities alongside traditional limitations. The success of their winter survival and the evidence of Ben's continued healthy development provided Sam with confidence that their family arrangement was working well enough to justify long-term planning and investment. The boy had not only adapted to mountain life, but was thriving in ways that suggested their unusual circumstances were providing advantages rather than merely adequate substitutes for conventional family structures. Most importantly, the emotional connection between them had developed into genuine affection and mutual respect that made their relationship feel natural and permanent rather than temporary and conditional. As winter gradually released its grip on the Blue Ridge Mountains and the first signs of spring began appearing in sheltered valleys and southern-facing slopes, Sam and Ben prepared for a new phase of their life together that would test their family bonds against outside pressures and unexpected revelations. The foundation they had built during months of isolation and shared challenges would soon face validation through community evaluation and personal discoveries that would transform their understanding of how they had come to find each other on that courthouse morning when $4 had seemed like such a significant investment in an uncertain future. Spring arrived in the Blue Ridge Mountains with the explosive energy of life reasserting itself after months of dormancy, bringing warm sunshine that melted accumulated snow into rushing streams and awakening wildflowers that carpeted forest floors and brilliant displays of color. Sam Hayes and Ben Collins stood together on the porch of their mountain cabin, breathing air that carried the scent of blooming dogwood and redbud, while listening to the symphony of returning songbirds that announced winter's definitive end. For both of them, this spring felt different from any they had experienced before, marking not just seasonal renewal but the completion of a transformation that had changed both their lives in ways they were still discovering. The months of isolation had created a bond between them that felt as natural and permanent as any biological relationship, with Ben unconsciously referring to Sam as Papa, and Sam finding himself thinking of the boy as his son in every meaningful sense. Their daily routines had evolved into efficient partnerships where each understood his role and responsibility, while contributing to their shared welfare according to his abilities and interests. The educational program that had developed during winter evenings had produced remarkable results, with Ben's reading and mathematical skills advancing to levels that impressed even Mrs. Dorothy Wells, whose decades of teaching experience provided reliable standards for academic assessment. The approaching spring also brought anticipation of renewed contact with the broader community and the opportunity to learn how the other Collins children were faring in their respective placements. Ben's continuing concern for his siblings, Emma, Tommy, and Lucy, remained a constant undercurrent in their family life, with the boy asking frequent questions about when they might visit and whether their new families were treating them with the same care and affection that he received from Sam. These conversations reminded Sam that their family unit, however successful it had become, was part of a larger story involving 4 children whose lives had been forever altered by tragedy and community decisions made during desperate circumstances. The first major test of their family stability came Unexpectedly on a warm April morning when Dr. Henry Coleman arrived at their mountain homestead accompanied by Miss Helen Crawford, a social worker from Asheville whose presence suggested official scrutiny of Ben's placement and care. Sam felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety as he recognized the kind of formal evaluation that could result in Ben's removal if authorities determined that their unconventional arrangement wasn't meeting established standards for child welfare. The months of happiness and mutual growth that had characterized their winter together suddenly felt fragile and temporary as official attention focused on their unusual family structure. Miss Crawford proved to be a competent professional whose primary concern was Ben's well-being rather than conformity to bureaucratic expectations about proper family arrangements. Her evaluation included detailed interviews with both Sam and Ben, examination of their living conditions and educational materials, and assessment of the boy's physical and emotional development since his placement. Ben approached these interviews with characteristic confidence and enthusiasm, describing his daily routines and learning experiences with the kind of detailed knowledge that demonstrated genuine engagement rather than superficial compliance with adult expectations. The most significant moment of Miss Crawford's evaluation came when Ben spontaneously began describing his memories of the mine accident that had claimed his parents and his recollections of the rescue efforts that had followed as he talked about the men who had worked desperately to save the trapped miners. His description of one particular rescuer became increasingly specific and detailed. "There was one man who was really strong and kind," Ben said, his voice carrying the intensity of important memories. "He carried my daddy out of the mine after they found him. He had a scar on his arm, and he told me everything would be okay, even though it wasn't true yet." Sam felt something cold settle in his stomach as Ben's description continued with details that seemed impossibly accurate for a 6-year-old's memories of traumatic events. The scar that ran along his left forearm was a distinctive mark that few people would remember unless they had specific reasons to notice it, while Ben's description of his height, build, and the way he had interacted with frightened children during the rescue operation seemed too precise to be coincidental. The possibility that Ben might have encountered him during those desperate days following the mine collapse had never occurred to Sam, partly because the rescue efforts had involved so many people and partly because his own memories of that period were fragmented by exhaustion and the overwhelming nature of the disaster. Miss Crawford's interest in Ben's recollections intensified as she realized that the boy was describing specific details about rescue operations that could be verified through official records and witness testimony. Her questions became more focused as she tried to determine whether Ben's memories were accurate and what implications they might have for understanding the connections that had led to his placement with Sam. The possibility that Sam had been personally involved in the rescue efforts that followed Tom Collins' death added emotional complexity to their family arrangement that extended far beyond simple charity or community obligation. Ben's most stunning revelation came when Miss Crawford asked him directly whether he remembered the name of the man who had carried his father from the mine. The boy's face brightened with the kind of recognition that suggested memories clicking into place after months of gradual development. "His name was Sam," Ben said with absolute certainty. "Sam Hayes, and when I saw him at the courthouse that day, I knew he was the same person who tried to save Daddy. That's why I wasn't scared when he took me home, because I remembered that he was one of the good men who helped people." The silence that followed Ben's revelation was profound and emotionally charged as both adults processed the implications of what they had just learned. Sam's memories of the rescue operation began shifting and reorganizing as he recalled specific moments and interactions that had been buried beneath the general trauma of those terrible days. He remembered carrying Tom Collins' body from the collapsed mine shaft and the crushing disappointment of arriving too late to save a man whose family would be left destitute by his death. He remembered a small boy watching from the crowd of family members who had gathered at the mine entrance, and he remembered trying to offer comfort to children who were too young to understand the finality of what had occurred. Miss Crawford's evaluation suddenly took on new dimensions as she recognized that Ben's placement with Sam represented not random charity, but the completion of a connection that had been established during one of the most traumatic events in both their lives. The boy's unconscious recognition of Sam as someone who had tried to help his family explained the remarkable ease with which they had adapted to living together and the trust that had developed between them with unusual speed. More importantly, it suggested that their family arrangement was based on genuine emotional foundations rather than merely practical convenience or community obligation. The revelation transformed Sam's understanding of his own motivations for bidding on Ben at the courthouse auction. What he had interpreted as impulsive compassion for an unwanted child suddenly seemed like the fulfillment of an incomplete rescue mission that had been weighing on his conscience for months without his conscious awareness of the connection. His failure to save Tom Collins had been one of many disappointments during the mine disaster, but Ben's presence in his life offered an opportunity to honor his father's memory by ensuring that at least one member of the Collins family would have the security and opportunities that Tom's death had threatened to destroy. Ben's reaction to having his memories validated and understood was immediate and profound. The boy's face showed relief and satisfaction as important pieces of his personal history finally made sense after months of fragmented recollections that had seemed disconnected from his current circumstances. His trust in Sam deepened as he realized that their relationship was based on genuine connections that predated the courthouse auction, while his confidence in their family's permanence increased as he understood that Sam's commitment to him was motivated by more than simple charity or duty. Miss Crawford's official report documented not only Ben's excellent health and educational progress, but also the unique circumstances that had brought him and Sam together through a combination of tragedy, community necessity, and personal connections that seemed almost providential in their timing and development. Her recommendation strongly supported continuing their family arrangement, while suggesting additional resources and support that could enhance Ben's educational opportunities without disrupting the stability and affection that characterized their home environment. The community's response to the revelation about Sam and Ben's prior connection was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Neighbors who had already approved of their family arrangement found additional validation for their support, while those who had harbored doubts about the propriety of a single man raising an orphaned child discovered emotional foundations that justified their success together. Pastor William Grant incorporated their story into sermons about divine providence and community responsibility, while Dr. Coleman used their example to illustrate the importance of supporting unconventional family structures that serve children's best interests. The most significant long-term consequence of Miss Crawford's evaluation was the official recommendation that efforts be made to reunite Ben with his siblings whenever possible without disrupting successful placements that were already working. Well, Emma Collins had been struggling with the emotional demands of her placement with an elderly couple whose physical limitations prevented them from providing adequate supervision and educational opportunities for a developing teenager. Tommy Collins had adapted well to farm work, but was receiving minimal formal education that would limit his future opportunities beyond manual labor. Lucy Collins was showing signs of depression and withdrawal that suggested her placement wasn't meeting her emotional needs despite adequate physical care. The possibility of reuniting some or all of the Collins siblings at the Hayes Mountain homestead represented both an opportunity and a challenge that would require careful planning and significant resources. Sam's property was large enough to accommodate additional children, and his success with Ben's education and development suggested that he could manage the complex needs of multiple young people if adequate support systems could be established. More importantly, Ben's obvious longing for his siblings and his thriving development in Sam's care suggested that family reunification might benefit everyone involved if it could be managed without disrupting positive progress. The summer of 1935 brought a series of developments that would transform the Hayes homestead from a simple family arrangement into something approaching a small educational institution that served as a model for innovative approaches to orphan care and rural education. Emma Collins was the first sibling to join their household. Arriving in June after her previous placement proved inadequate for her developmental needs and educational potential. At 13, Emma brought domestic skills and maternal instincts that complemented Sam's practical education while providing Ben with the family connection he had missed since their separation at the courthouse auction. Emma's integration into their household revealed the complexity of managing multiple children with different needs, abilities, and emotional histories. Her natural inclination to assume responsibility for Ben's care sometimes conflicted with the parental authority that Sam had developed during their months together, while her own educational needs required resources and attention that strained the systems that had worked well for a single child. Most challenging was her need to process grief and loss that was different from Ben's experience, since her greater maturity at the time of their parents' death had given her clearer understanding of the permanence and implications of their tragedy. Tommy Collins joined their family in August, bringing agricultural skills and mechanical aptitude that immediately enhanced their farming operations, while creating additional challenges for educational planning and household management. At 11, Tommy was old enough to contribute significantly to their mountain homestead's productivity, but he also needed the kind of formal instruction that would prepare him for opportunities beyond subsistence farming. His quiet determination and strong work ethic made him an ideal addition to their family structure, though his reserved personality required patience and understanding as he adapted to new relationships and routines. Lucy Collins completed their sibling reunification in September, arriving with artistic talents and emotional sensitivity that added new dimensions to their family dynamic while requiring specialized attention to help her overcome the depression and withdrawal that had characterized her previous placement. At 9, Lucy needed more nurturing and protection than her older siblings, while possessing creative abilities that deserved cultivation and encouragement. Her reunion with Ben was particularly emotional, restoring a relationship that had been central to both children's happiness before their family's tragedy. The transformation of the Hayes homestead to accommodate 4 children required significant modifications to their physical infrastructure and daily routines. Additional bedrooms were created in previously unused spaces, while common areas were reorganized to provide adequate space for individual activities and family gatherings. The educational component of their household expanded to include multiple grade levels and learning styles, with Sam developing curriculum strategies that could meet diverse needs while maintaining the practical focus that had proven so successful. With Ben's development, the community response to the Collins siblings' reunification at the Hayes property was overwhelmingly supportive, with neighbors contributing labor, materials, and expertise to help establish systems that could support their expanded family success. Mrs. Dorothy Wells provided advanced educational materials and curriculum guidance that enabled Sam to offer instruction comparable to formal schools while maintaining the individualized attention and practical application that gave their approach distinctive advantages. Dr. Coleman monitored all 4 children's health and development while documenting their progress for official reports that would influence policy discussions about innovative approaches to orphan care. The success of their expanded family arrangement attracted attention from government officials and social work professionals who were seeking alternatives to institutional orphanages that had proven expensive and largely ineffective at preparing children for productive adult lives. State agencies began documenting their methods and outcomes as potential models for replication in other rural communities facing similar challenges with orphan children, and limited resources for traditional institutional care. By 1937, the Hayes Mountain Homestead had become an unofficial demonstration site for innovative, rural education and family-based orphan care that was drawing visitors from across the Southeast and influencing policy discussions at state and federal levels. All 4 Collins children were thriving academically and emotionally under Sam's care, with Emma showing particular promise for advanced education that could lead to teacher training, Tommy developing mechanical skills that suggested potential for engineering or technical careers, Lucy creating artwork that was gaining recognition beyond their local community, and Ben continuing to excel in all areas of development while serving as an unofficial ambassador for their family's success. The most profound validation of their achievements came in 1938 when Ben, now 10 years old, was invited to speak at a conference of social workers and educators about his experiences with family-based care versus institutional alternatives. His articulate description of his education and development under Sam's guidance provided compelling evidence that well-designed family placements could produce outcomes that exceeded what even well-funded institutions typically achieved. More importantly, his obvious confidence, intelligence, and emotional stability demonstrated that unconventional family structures could provide the love and security that children needed for healthy development. The long-term impact of Sam's $4 investment in Ben's future extended far beyond their individual family success to influence systematic changes in how American society approached orphan care and rural education. The documentation of their methods and outcomes contributed to federal legislation that prioritized family-based placements over institutional care while providing support and resources that made such arrangements more feasible for rural communities. Their educational approach influenced teacher training programs and curriculum development that emphasized practical application and individualized instruction alongside traditional academic subjects. 20 years after that courthouse auction in Millbrook, North Carolina, Sam Hayes found himself standing before a gathering of social workers, educators, and government officials who had come to study the long-term outcomes of the family-based orphan care model that had emerged from his impulsive decision to spend his last $4 on a child who needed a home. Emma Collins Hayes had become a teacher whose innovative methods were being implemented in schools across 3 states. Tommy Collins Hayes had established a manufacturing business that employed dozens of people while developing agricultural equipment that increased productivity for small farmers throughout the region. Lucy Collins Hayes had become a recognized artist whose work celebrated mountain culture while contributing to economic development through tourism and cultural programs. Ben Collins Hayes had graduated from college with degrees in engineering and education, returning to their mountain community to establish technical schools that provided advanced training for rural young people who wanted careers that combined traditional mountain values with modern economic opportunities. The revelation that had emerged during Miss Crawford's evaluation about Sam's role in the mine rescue that claimed Ben's father had taken on deeper significance as their family story became part of the historical record. What had seemed like coincidence or providence at the time was now understood as an example of how communities create informal networks of care and responsibility that transcend official systems and bureaucratic structures. Sam's unconscious recognition of Ben as a child whose father he had tried to save had motivated acts of love and commitment that transformed both their lives while creating a model that influenced national policy and helped thousands of other children find permanent families instead of institutional care. The most meaningful moment of that commemoration came when Ben, now 30 years old and a leader in educational innovation, publicly thanked Sam for seeing potential in a frightened 6-year-old boy that no one else had been willing to invest in. 24 years ago, Ben said to the assembled audience, a mountain farmer spent $4 he couldn't afford on a child he didn't know, not because he expected any return on that investment, but because he believed every child deserved someone who would fight for their future. That $4 bought me not just a home, but a father who taught me that love is measured not by what we receive, but by what we give to others. As the formal presentations concluded and the visitors departed for their hotels and transportation back to cities and institutions across the country, the Hayes family gathered on their mountain porch for one of their traditional evening conversations. Under stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than anywhere else on earth, Sam, now 62 but still vigorous from a lifetime of mountain living and meaningful work, looked around at the four remarkable adults who had started as orphan children and become his greatest pride and deepest joy. "Do you ever wonder, what would have happened if you hadn't bid on me that day?" Ben asked, his question carrying the same thoughtful curiosity that had characterized him as a child but now informed by decades of experience and achievement that had validated every investment Sam had made in his potential. Sam considered the question seriously, as he always did when his children asked him to reflect on the choices and circumstances that had shaped their family's history. "I think about it sometimes," he replied, "but not in a regretful way. More like wondering about all the families we've helped create and all the children who found homes because we proved it was possible to build something good from tragedy and loss. I think about the policies that changed because someone was willing to demonstrate that love and commitment matter more than conventional family structures." Emma, now 37 and serving as principal of a school system that had adopted their educational innovations, smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had found her life's purpose and achieved it beyond her wildest childhood dreams. "The remarkable thing is that we all became exactly who we were meant to be, but none of us could have gotten there alone. It took all of us working together to create the opportunities that let each of us find our individual paths while staying connected as a family." As their conversation continued late into the night, touching on memories, current projects, and dreams for future generations, Sam realized that they had accomplished something that extended far beyond education policy or social work innovation, or even individual success stories. They had proven that the most important investments we make aren't measured in dollars or institutional programs, but in the relationships we create and the love we share and the commitment we make to helping others discover their own potential for greatness. The legacy they had created would continue through the thousands of families who had learned that love could triumph over loss, that opportunity could be created where none existed before, and that success was always measured by how many other people you helped achieve their own dreams. Outside, the mountains that had witnessed 3 generations of Hayes family history stood unchanged. But inside the house that had become a symbol of innovative family-based care, 5 people who had chosen to become a family sat together planning new ways to ensure that no child would ever again have to face the world without someone who believed in their potential and was willing to invest everything in helping them find it. The boy who had once been worth $4 had become priceless, not just to the man who had chosen to love him, but to an entire nation that was better because one person had decided that every child deserved the chance to find their place in a family that would fight for their future and believe in their dreams. That courthouse morning in 1934, when Sam Hayes had spent his last $4 on Ben Collins, had seemed like the end of his financial resources, but it had actually been the beginning of wealth that couldn't be measured in money, success that couldn't be quantified in statistics, and a family that had proven love was the only investment that guaranteed exponential returns across generations. The December wind howled through the Blue Ridge Mountains with a ferocity that reminded every resident why these ancient peaks had claimed so many lives over the centuries. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes that obscured familiar landmarks and transformed the landscape into a treacherous maze where even experienced mountain dwellers could lose their way within yards of safety. Sam Hayes stood at his kitchen window, watching the accumulation build against the north side of his cabin while calculating How long their carefully preserved supplies would need to last if this storm proved to be the beginning of one of those legendary mountain winters that could isolate homesteads for months at a time. Ben Collins, now 7 years old and tall for his age, pressed his small hands against the frosted glass beside Sam's weathered fingers, his breath creating temporary clouds that quickly disappeared as the cold penetrated even the thick log walls that had sheltered 3 generations of the Hayes family. The boy had been living on the mountain for over a year now, and his adaptation to the rhythms and challenges of isolated rural life had been remarkable in its completeness. Where once he had been a town child accustomed to neighbors within shouting distance and stores within walking range, he had become a competent mountain boy who could read weather signs, tend livestock in harsh conditions, and find his way through forests that would confuse most adults. The transformation in both their lives during the past 14 months had been profound and multifaceted, extending far beyond the simple arrangement of an adult providing care for an orphan child. Sam had discovered paternal instincts and emotional depths that he had thought were permanently buried along with his dreams of biological fatherhood, while Ben had found security and purpose that had replaced the trauma and uncertainty that had characterized his existence since his parents' deaths. More importantly, they had developed a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection that made their unusual family arrangement feel natural and permanent rather than temporary and conditional. The educational program that had evolved during their time together had produced results that exceeded anything Sam had imagined possible when he first committed to Ben's care and development. The boy's reading abilities had advanced to levels that impressed Mrs. Dorothy Wells, whose decades of teaching experience provided reliable standards for academic assessment. His mathematical skills had progressed far beyond basic arithmetic toward concepts that would have challenged children several years older. Most remarkably, his curiosity about the natural world and his mechanical aptitude suggested intellectual potential that deserved cultivation and opportunities that their mountain isolation might not be able to provide indefinitely. Ben's practical education had been equally impressive, with the boy mastering skills that many adults never developed despite years of mountain living. He could identify edible plants, track animals, predict weather changes, and perform dozens of tasks related to farming, construction, and equipment maintenance that would serve him regardless of what direction his adult life ultimately took. His natural affinity for working with animals had made him invaluable in managing their livestock, while his quick understanding of mechanical principles had enabled him to assist with repairs and improvements that would have been impossible for Sam to manage alone. The social aspects of their family arrangement had proven more complex and significant than either of them had initially anticipated. Ben's presence in Sam's life had forced his reintegration into community activities and relationships that he had abandoned during his period of grief-induced isolation following Martha's death. Church services, community gatherings, and informal networks of mutual assistance had become important parts of their routine as neighbors recognized that Ben needed exposure to broader social influences than Sam alone could provide. These interactions had been beneficial for both of them, with Sam rediscovering the satisfaction of participating in collective endeavors, while Ben developed social skills and community connections that would serve him throughout his life. The most significant challenge they faced as winter deepened was not practical but emotional, involving Ben's continuing concern for his siblings, Emma, Tommy, and Lucy, who remained scattered among different families throughout the county. The boy's questions about his brothers and sisters had become more frequent and more specific as his own security with Sam had enabled him to focus on relationships beyond their immediate household. His memories of family life before the mine accident remained vivid and important to his sense of identity, while his understanding of the circumstances that had led to their separation had developed alongside his intellectual maturity. Sam's efforts to maintain some connection between Ben and his siblings had been complicated by distances, weather, and the varying attitudes of the families who had taken responsibility for the other Collins children. Emma's placement with the elderly Wells couple had provided stability, but limited opportunities for the kind of social interaction that teenage girls needed for healthy development. Tommy's situation with the Morrison family had worked well for agricultural training, but offered minimal formal education that would prepare him for opportunities beyond manual labor. Lucy's placement had been the most problematic, with reports suggesting that her artistic temperament and emotional sensitivity were not being adequately understood or nurtured by her current guardians. The revelation that would transform their understanding of their relationship and its deeper significance came on a February morning when Dr. Henry Coleman arrived at their mountain homestead, accompanied by Miss Helen Crawford, a social worker from Asheville, whose presence suggested official evaluation of Ben's placement and progress. Sam felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety as he recognized the kind of formal assessment that could result in Ben's removal if authorities determined that their unconventional arrangement wasn't meeting established standards for child welfare and development. Miss Crawford proved to be a competent professional whose primary concern was Ben's well-being rather than conformity to bureaucratic expectations about proper family structures. Her evaluation included detailed interviews with both Sam and Ben, examination of their living conditions and educational materials, and assessment of the boy's physical and emotional development since his placement. Ben approached these interviews with characteristic confidence and enthusiasm, describing his daily routines and learning experiences with the kind of detailed knowledge that demonstrated genuine engagement rather than superficial compliance with adult expectations. The most significant moment of Miss Crawford's evaluation came when Ben spontaneously began describing his memories of the mine accident that had claimed his parents and his recollections of the rescue efforts that had followed. As he talked about the men who had worked desperately to save the trapped miners, his description of one particular rescuer became increasingly specific and detailed. His voice carried the intensity of important memories as he described a man who had been especially kind during those terrible days, someone who had tried to comfort the children while their world collapsed around them. Sam felt something cold and electric settle in his chest as Ben's description continued with details that seemed impossibly accurate for a child's memories of traumatic events that had occurred more than a year earlier. The boy's recollection of physical characteristics, manner of speaking, and specific actions during the rescue operation were too precise to be coincidental or imagined. Most disturbing was Ben's description of a distinctive scar on the man's left forearm, a mark that few people would remember unless they had specific reasons to notice it during emotionally charged circumstances. The possibility that Ben might have encountered him during those desperate days following the mine collapse had never occurred to Sam, partly because the rescue efforts had involved so many people from throughout the region, and partly because his own memories of that period were fragmented by exhaustion and the overwhelming nature of the disaster. He had participated in the rescue operation as one of dozens of volunteers who had worked around the clock trying to reach the trapped miners, but his recollections of specific interactions with family members were buried beneath the general trauma of recovering bodies rather than saving lives. Ben's most stunning revelation came when Miss Crawford asked him directly whether he remembered anything specific about the man who had been so kind during the rescue operation. The boy's face brightened with the kind of recognition that suggested memories clicking into place after months of gradual development. His voice was clear and certain as he described not just physical characteristics, but personality, traits and behaviors that demonstrated remarkable retention of detail from experiences that had occurred when he was only 6 years old. He was really tall and strong, and he had gentle hands when he helped move the hurt people, Ben said, his words carrying the weight of memories that had been carefully preserved despite their traumatic context. He told me that my daddy was a brave man who had tried to protect the other miners when the rocks started falling. And he promised me that even though Daddy couldn't come home anymore, there were still good people in the world who would take care of children who needed help. The silence that followed Ben's recollection was profound and emotionally charged as both adults processed the implications of what they had just heard. Sam's memories of the rescue operation began shifting and reorganizing as specific moments, and interactions emerged from the general blur of those terrible days. He remembered carrying Tom Collins' body from the collapsed mine shaft and the crushing disappointment of arriving too late to save a man whose family would be left destitute by his death. More vividly, he remembered a small boy watching from the crowd of family members who had gathered at the mine entrance, and his own attempts to offer comfort to children who were too young to understand the finality of what had occurred. Miss Crawford's evaluation suddenly took on new dimensions as she recognized that Ben's placement with Sam represented not random charity, but the completion of a connection that had been established during one of the most traumatic events in both their lives. The boy's unconscious recognition of Sam as someone who had tried to help his family explained the remarkable ease with which they had adapted to living together, and the trust that had developed between them with unusual speed for such disparate circumstances. Ben's next words provided the final confirmation that transformed their understanding of how fate and community responsibility had brought them together. When I saw him at the courthouse that day when they were trying to find homes for us, the boy continued, his voice growing stronger with the confidence that comes from finally making sense of confusing memories, I knew he was the same person who had been kind to me when Daddy died. That's why I wasn't scared when he took me home, because I remembered that he was one of the good men who helped people even when it was hard and sad. The revelation transformed Sam's understanding of his own motivations for bidding on Ben. At the courthouse auction, what he had interpreted as impulsive compassion for an unwanted child suddenly seemed like the fulfillment of an incomplete rescue mission that had been weighing on his conscience for months without his conscious awareness of the specific connection. His failure to save Tom Collins had been one of many disappointments during the mine disaster, but Ben's presence in his life offered an opportunity to honor his father's memory by ensuring that at least one member of the Collins family would have the security and opportunities that Tom's death had threatened to destroy. Ben's reaction to having his memories validated and understood was immediate and profound. The boy's face showed relief and satisfaction as important pieces of his personal history finally made sense after months of fragmented recollections that had seemed disconnected from his current circumstances. His trust in Sam deepened as he realized that their relationship was based on genuine connections that predated the courthouse auction, while his confidence in their family's permanence increased as he understood that Sam's commitment to him was motivated by more than simple charity or community obligation. Miss Crawford's official report documented not only Ben's excellent health and educational progress, but also the unique circumstances that had brought him and Sam together through a combination of tragedy, community necessity, and personal connections that seemed almost providential in their timing and development. Her recommendations strongly supported continuing their family arrangement, while suggesting additional resources and support that could enhance Ben's educational opportunities without disrupting the stability and affection that characterized their home environment. The community's response to the revelation about Sam and Ben's prior connection was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Neighbors who had already approved of their family arrangement found additional validation for their support, while those who had harbored doubts about the propriety of a single man raising an orphaned child discovered emotional foundations that justified their success together. Pastor William Grant incorporated their story into sermons about divine providence and community responsibility, while Dr. Coleman used their example to illustrate the importance of supporting unconventional family structures that serve children's best interests. The most significant long-term consequence of Miss Crawford's evaluation was the official recommendation that efforts be made to reunite Ben with his siblings whenever possible without disrupting successful placements that were already working. Well, Emma Collins had been struggling with the emotional demands of her placement with an elderly couple whose physical limitations prevented them from providing adequate supervision and educational opportunities for a developing teenager. Tommy Collins had adapted well to farm work, but was receiving minimal formal education that would limit his future opportunities beyond manual labor. Lucy Collins was showing signs of depression and withdrawal that suggested her placement wasn't meeting her emotional needs despite adequate physical care. The possibility of reuniting some or all of the Collins siblings at the Hayes Mountain homestead represented both an opportunity and a challenge that would require careful planning and significant resources. Sam's property was large enough to accommodate additional children, and his success with Ben's education and development suggested that he could manage the complex needs of multiple young people if adequate support systems could be established. More importantly, Ben's obvious longing for his siblings and his thriving development in Sam's care suggested that family reunification might benefit everyone involved if it could be managed without disrupting positive progress. Sam's decision to pursue sibling reunification was influenced not only by Ben's emotional needs, but also by his growing understanding of the broader implications of successful family-based orphan care. The documentation of their methods and outcomes was already attracting attention from social work professionals and government officials who were seeking alternatives to institutional orphanages that had proven expensive and largely ineffective at preparing children for productive adult lives. The possibility of demonstrating that rural families could successfully care for multiple orphan children might influence policy decisions that could benefit thousands of other children facing similar circumstances. The summer of 1936 brought the first steps toward Collins' family reunification when Emma, now 14 years old, joined their household after her previous placement proved inadequate for her developmental needs and educational potential. Her arrival transformed their mountain homestead from a simple family arrangement into something approaching a small educational institution where multiple children could receive individualized instruction while contributing to agricultural operations that supported their collective welfare. Emma's integration into their household revealed both the benefits and challenges of managing multiple children with different needs, abilities, and emotional histories. Her natural inclination to assume responsibility for Ben's care sometimes conflicted with the parental authority that Sam had developed during their months together, while her own educational needs required resources and attention that strained systems that had worked well for a single child. Most challenging was her need to process grief and loss that was different from Ben's experience, since her greater maturity at the time of their parents' death had given her clearer understanding of the permanence and implications of their tragedy. Tommy Collins joined their family in September, bringing agricultural skills and mechanical aptitude that immediately enhanced their farming operations, while creating additional challenges for educational planning and household management. At 12, Tommy was old enough to contribute significantly to their mountain homestead's productivity, but he also needed the kind of formal instruction that would prepare him for opportunities beyond subsistence farming. His quiet determination and strong work ethic made him an ideal addition to their family structure, though his reserved personality required patience and understanding as he adapted to new relationships and routines. Lucy Collins completed their sibling reunification the following spring, arriving with artistic talents and emotional sensitivity that added new dimensions to their family dynamic, while requiring specialized attention to help her overcome the depression and withdrawal that had characterized her previous placement. At 10, Lucy needed more nurturing and protection than her older siblings, while possessing creative abilities that deserved cultivation and encouragement. Her reunion with Ben was particularly emotional, restoring a relationship that had been central to both children's happiness before their family's tragedy. The success of the Collins sibling reunification at the Hayes Mountain homestead attracted national attention from social work professionals, educators, and government officials who were documenting innovative approaches to orphan care in rural education. By 1939, their family had become an unofficial demonstration site for methods that emphasized family preservation, individualized education, and community-based support systems that could produce outcomes superior to those achieved by institutional alternatives. The long-term validation of their approach came 25 years later when Ben Collins Hayes, now 32 years old and serving as director of a regional educational cooperative that had adopted their methods, was invited to testify before a congressional committee investigating alternatives to institutional orphan care. His articulate description of his education and development under Sam's guidance provided compelling evidence that well-designed family placements could produce outcomes that exceeded what even well-funded institutions typically achieved. Standing before the assembled legislators and policy experts, Ben's presence embodied the success of an approach that had begun with one man's $4 investment in a child's potential. His professional achievements as an educator and his personal stability as a husband and father demonstrated that love and commitment could triumph over the most challenging circumstances when communities supported innovative solutions to complex social problems. The most profound moment of Ben's testimony came when he directly addressed the economic arguments that typically dominated discussions about orphan care policy. 28 years ago, he said, his voice carrying the same thoughtful clarity that had characterized him as a child, a mountain farmer spent $4 he couldn't afford on a boy he didn't know, not because he expected any return on that investment, but because he believed every child deserved someone who would fight for their future. That $4 bought me not just a home, but a father who taught me that success is measured not by what we accumulate, but by what we contribute to others' welfare. The ripple effects of Sam's original decision continued to influence social policy and individual lives long after that courthouse morning in 1934, when $4 had seemed like such a significant expenditure for uncertain prospects. The documentation of their family's methods and outcomes had contributed to federal legislation that prioritized family-based placements over institutional care while providing support and resources that made such arrangements more feasible for rural communities throughout America. Emma Collins Hayes had become a teacher whose innovative methods were being implemented in schools across the Southeast, proving that children who experienced family-based care could become leaders who transformed the systems that had once failed to serve them adequately. Tommy Collins Hayes had established a manufacturing business that employed dozens of people while developing agricultural equipment that increased productivity for small farmers throughout the region. Lucy Collins Hayes had become a recognized artist whose work celebrated mountain culture while contributing to economic development through tourism and cultural programs that brought prosperity to previously isolated communities. The evening conversations that had characterized their family life throughout Ben's childhood continued well into his adulthood, with the Hayes Mountain homestead serving as a gathering place where four remarkable individuals who had started as orphan children could reflect on the journey that had brought them from tragedy to triumph. Sam, now in his 70s but still vigorous from a lifetime of mountain living and meaningful work, looked around at the adults who had become his greatest pride and deepest joy. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't recognized me that day at the courthouse? Sam asked Ben during one of these conversations, his question carrying the weight of decades spent contemplating the coincidences and choices that had shaped their family's extraordinary story. Ben considered the question with the same careful attention he brought to all complex issues, his response reflecting both gratitude for what had been achieved and awareness of the broader implications of their success. "I think about it often," he replied, but not in terms of what we might have missed. Instead, I think about all the families we've helped create and all the children who found homes because we proved that love and commitment matter more than conventional structures or bureaucratic expectations. The legacy of their family extended far beyond individual success stories to influence fundamental changes in how American society approached orphan care, rural education, and community responsibility for vulnerable children. The $4 that had seemed like Sam's last financial resource in 1934 had generated returns that couldn't be measured in monetary terms, but had created wealth in the form of lives transformed, policies improved, and communities strengthened. Through examples of what was possible when people chose to invest in human potential rather than institutional convenience. As the mountain stars emerged in the darkening sky above their valley, 4 generations of love and achievement gathered around the same table where a frightened 6-year-old boy had once learned that he was wanted and valued by someone who would fight for his future. The echo of their laughter and conversation carried across peaks that had witnessed the growth of a family that proved ordinary. People could create extraordinary change when they chose to measure success by the lives they touched rather than the possessions they accumulated. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.